In March of 1921, in the city of Florence, Italy, a man named Guccio Gucci opened a small leather goods shop on the Via della Vigna Nuova. He had spent years working as a hotel porter in London, carrying luggage for wealthy guests at the Savoy, watching closely how rich people dressed, what they carried, and what those objects communicated about who they were. He came home to Florence with precise understanding of what luxury meant to the kind of people who could afford it. The shop he opened sold saddles, equestrian equipment, and small leather accessories, bags, belts, wallets, made with a level of craftsmanship that immediately set them apart from anything else available in the city. He died in 1953 and never saw what his name would become. But he built something that his sons would transform into one of the most recognizable luxury brands in human history. And then his grandchildren would destroy it. What happened to the Gucci family over the 60 years between the founding of that Florence leather shop in the early 1990s is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of business. It involves tax fraud, prison sentences handed down to one of the most successful businessmen of the 20th century, a family member who testified against his own father, a murder carried out on the steps of a Milan office building by professional hitmen hired by an ex-wife, and the eventual expulsion of every single member of the founding family from the company that bore their name. By the time the last Gucci sold his last share, the family had nothing left but the name, and they no longer owned that either. Guccio's sons were named Aldo and Rodolfo. They were, in almost every way, a perfect complementary pair. Aldo was a commercial force, extroverted, aggressive, with an instinctive understanding of marketing and retail expansion that was decades ahead of its time. Rodolfo was the aesthetic force, a former film actor in his youth, with a refined visual sensibility and a devotion to the craftsmanship traditions that his father had established. Together, they took a Florentine leather shop and turned it into a global empire. Aldo opened the first American store on Fifth Avenue in New York City in 1953, the year his father died. It was an act of extraordinary audacity. There was no roadmap for a small Italian artisan brand establishing itself as a luxury destination in the most competitive retail market in the world. The store was an immediate sensation. The double G logo, the green-red-green stripe, the horsebit loafer, these became signatures of a specific kind of aspirational elegance that resonated with the expanding American professional class of the post-war boom. By the 1960s and 1970s, Gucci was not merely a brand, it was a cultural reference point. The problems began, as they so often do in family businesses, in the next generation. Aldo had 3 sons, Giorgio, Paolo, and Roberto. Rodolfo had 1 son, Maurizio. The 4 cousins had grown up in the shadow of 2 dominant fathers and had spent their entire professional lives working within an institution that was simultaneously their birthright and their cage. The dynamics were poisonous in ways that took decades to fully erupt. Aldo retained control of the American operations. Rodolfo controlled the Italian and European side. Neither was inclined toward transparency. Equity was distributed unevenly. Decision-making was opaque. Credit was never clearly assigned. By the late 1970s, the company was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue, and the family was consuming itself arguing over who deserved what share of it. Paolo Gucci, Aldo's middle son, was the first to break. He wanted creative control. He wanted to launch his own line under his own name. Aldo refused. The conflict escalated through years of lawsuits, board meetings that ended in physical confrontations, and a level of personal animosity that made any professional resolution impossible. In 1986, Paolo made the decision that would define the Gucci dynasty for the next decade. He provided information to the United States Internal Revenue Service documenting a scheme by which Aldo Gucci had evaded approximately $7 million in American taxes. The information was devastating and specific. Aldo Gucci was 81 years old when he was convicted of tax evasion in a New York federal court. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison. He served it. His own son had put him there. Meanwhile, on the other branch of the family tree, something entirely different was developing. Rodolfo Gucci died in 1983, leaving his 50% stake in the company to his son Maurizio. Maurizio was not like his father or his uncle. He was thoughtful, intellectually curious, deeply interested in the creative direction of the brand. He had studied law. He had spent years learning the business from the ground up, working in the warehouses and the showrooms before taking any management role. When he inherited control of his half of the company, he moved quickly to expand his influence, buying out the exhausted and litigious sons of his uncle until he effectively controlled the entire enterprise. For a moment in the late 1980s and very early 1990s, it appeared that Maurizio Gucci might actually save what the family had built. He hired the designer Don Mello from Bergdorf Goodman to refocus the brand. He brought in Tom Ford as a designer, a decision that would, years after Mauricio's involvement, prove to be one of the most consequential creative hirings in the history of fashion. He began the work of repositioning Gucci from a brand that had been degraded by decades of over-licensing. Gucci's name had appeared on everything from cigarette lighters to toilet paper, back to something that deserved to be called a luxury house. The work was right. The instincts were sound. The execution required money and patience that Maurizio was running out of. To fund the repositioning, Maurizio sold a stake in the company to an investment firm called InvestCorp in 1989. The stake was 47.5%. He retained the rest. But the business continued to struggle financially, and InvestCorp continued to acquire additional shares. By 1993, Maurizio Gucci's financial situation had become untenable. He sold his remaining shares to InvestCorp for approximately $170 million. The deal closed. The last member of the Gucci family with any ownership in the company walked away. The name that Guccio had built in that Florence leather shop in 1921 now belonged entirely to people who shared none of his blood. Maurizio Gucci was 50 years old. He had been divorced from his wife Patrizia Reggiani, a woman he had married in 1972 and who had spent 2 decades building her identity around the Gucci name, and was living with a new partner. Patrizia had received a settlement in the divorce that many, including Patrizia herself, considered inadequate given the wealth she believed she had helped create. She described herself in interviews as someone who had been discarded. She described Maurizio as someone who had betrayed not only her personally, but the entire heritage of the family she had married into. On the morning of March 27, 1995, Maurizio Gucci was shot 4 times on the steps of his office building on Via Palestro in Milan by a professional hitman. He died at the scene. He was 46 years old. The investigation that followed took years and ultimately led to the arrest and conviction of Patrizia Reggiani for ordering the murder. She was sentenced to 26 years in prison, later reduced to 18, and served most of it before being released in 2016. She has never expressed remorse. In one of the most remarkable statements in the long history of remarkable Gucci statements, she said she would rather cry in a Rolls-Royce than be happy on a bicycle. The company that the Gucci family had built and then destroyed went on, without them, to become one of the most valuable luxury brands in the world. Under Tom Ford's creative direction in the late 1990s, and under successive outside management teams through the 2000s and beyond, Gucci generated billions in annual revenue and became a symbol of fashion's most potent aspirational power. It is now part of the Kering Group, the French luxury conglomerate. It generates more than $10 billion in annual sales. No member of the Gucci family owns any part of it or has any involvement with it. The story of the Gucci family is, in the most fundamental sense, a story about what happens when the institution that a family builds becomes more valuable than the relationships within the family itself. The conflicts that tore the Guccis apart were not unusual. Disputes over equity, disputes over credit, disputes over creative control. These are the normal frictions of any family business. What was unusual was the scale of what was at stake and the willingness of each successive generation to escalate. A son who reports his father to federal authorities. A woman who hires men with guns. These are not ordinary business decisions. They are the decisions of people who have concluded that the alternative, accepting less than what they believe they are owed, is worse than any consequence. In each case, the consequences were severe. In each case, the person who escalated lost more than they gained. And in the end, the thing they were all fighting over, the company, the name, the legacy, passed entirely out of the family's hands. They destroyed each other and called it victory, subscribed to the reckoning. Every Tuesday, the true story behind the empires the world knows, and the people who built them fought over them and lost them. Next week, he started a company in his dorm room with $27, His best friend and business partner took the company's biggest client, the entire sales team, and every piece of proprietary software on a Thursday. By Monday, the original founder had filed a lawsuit that created legal precedent still cited in courts today. The story nobody in Silicon Valley talks about because it hits too close to home. Subscribe, hit the bell,